there.
Yeah. Do you think you could beat me in a fight?
Yes. Pretty good at hand-to-hand combat.
You wanna find out, puppy?
Are you in the Illuminati?
Not currently. They have been.
The neon glow of the gym lights cast long shadows on the sweat-streaked mats, their surface worn from the endless repetition of blows exchanged over time. The air was thick with the scent of rubber, disinfectant, and adrenaline. An atmosphere charged with the weight of competition. This was more than just a place to train. For some, it was an arena where reputations were carved into the walls, where each punch thrown carried the weight of something bigger than the fight itself. It was here, amidst the rhythmic pounding of gloves against bags and the grunts of effort, that Jake Paul stood at the center of attention, wrapping his hands with slow, deliberate movements. His entourage lingered close, their voices a steady hum of encouragement, jokes, and hype. They laughed when he did, nodded when he spoke, feeding off his energy like satellites orbiting their central sun. Jake reveled in it. This wasn't just another night at the gym. This was a statement, another opportunity to remind everyone who he was. He thrived on moments like this, where eyes followed his every move, where cameras discreetly recorded his training, where his presence alone set the tempo for the room. But not everyone in the gym moved to his rhythm. Across the space, Connor Hayes leaned against the ropes of an old sparring ring, arms folded, eyes steady and cold. He had been watching, studying, letting every exaggerated motion of Jake's training session fuel the quiet storm within him. There was a certain disdain in his posture, a rigidity that spoke of unspoken resentment. It wasn't just about Jake, it was about everything he represented. The shortcuts, the spectacle, the privilege of fame that had paved his way into the sport without the years of struggle that others had endured. Connor had been fighting since before people knew his name, back when every victory came with broken knuckles and bruised ribs rather than sponsorships and viral clips. He had spent years in the underground circuits, cutting his teeth in grimy, dimly lit gyms where respect wasn't given. It was earned in blood and endurance. He had clawed his way up, fought opponents who didn't care about cameras, men who didn't talk before fights because they knew their fists would do the speaking for them. And yet here was Jake, strolling into the world of boxing with all the confidence of a man who had never once worried about losing more than a fight. Jake noticed him watching. Of course he did. He always knew when someone was looking. Attention was his currency, and he spent it freely. With a smirk that came too easily, he finished wrapping his hands and made his way across the gym, his entourage following at a slight distance, waiting for the inevitable spectacle. Stopping a few feet away, he made a show of cracking his knuckles, rolling his shoulders as if loosening up for something. His voice carried across the gym easily, laced with the familiar mix of mockery and self-assured arrogance that had become his signature. He wanted a reaction, something to fuel the moment, to give the audience, whether in the gym or online, something to talk about. Connor remained still, unmoved, his gaze locked onto Jake's with a levelness that made the air between them feel heavier. He let the words pass over him like waves crashing against a rock, unshaken, unaffected. He had heard worse. He had fought worse. But Jake didn't let silence linger for long. He pushed further, stepping closer, circling like a predator that had never known the taste of true hunger. His words dug deeper now, not just playful jabs, but calculated insults meant to provoke. He spoke of legacy, of status, of relevance. He questioned Connor's worth in a sport that, according to him, thrived on spectacle rather than skill. Connor's fists curled at his sides, his breath slow, measured. It would have been so easy to throw a punch right then, to let his knuckles find the smirk stretched across Jake's face. The thought flickered like a match struck against stone, a brief and dangerous temptation, but he didn't move. Instead, he let the silence stretch, let the tension build until it pressed against everyone in the room. And then, with deliberate slowness, he turned away. The gesture was more powerful than any insult he could have spoken. It wasn't a retreat. It wasn't backing down. It was dismissal, total and absolute. And in that moment, it was the most cutting response he could have given. Jake's smirk faltered just for a second, just enough for those paying attention to notice. He had expected a fight, a moment of raw physical conflict that could be captured, shared, turned into content. But instead, he had been treated as something insignificant, as if all his words and presence amounted to nothing more than background noise in Connor's world. The gym had grown quieter, the once lively energy now thick with anticipation. The onlookers, whether Jake's entourage or regulars who had seen real fights unfold on these mats, watched carefully, waiting to see what would happen next, but there was nothing left to say. Connor had already left the moment behind him. Jake let out a slow breath, rolling his jaw as if to shake off whatever had just happened. His entourage recovered quickly, their voices filling the space again, with reassurances, jokes, anything to shift the attention back to their leader. But there was no mistaking the shift in the air. Something had begun that night, something that wouldn't be left behind as easily as Connor had walked away. And as Jake turned back toward his training, throwing a punch that landed harder than it needed to on the nearest bag, there was a flicker of something in his expression, something colder, more determined. The night wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The fallout from the gym encounter did not settle quietly. It never could, not in a world where every moment was dissected, replayed, and amplified by millions of unseen eyes. Within hours, clips had surfaced across every platform, the tension between Jake and Connor frozen in pixels and captions that twisted the narrative in every possible direction. Some called it an act of defiance, proof that Connor refused to entertain Jake's antics. Others saw it as a retreat, a man unwilling to meet confrontation head-on. The truth, of course, lay somewhere in the middle, but in the arena of public perception, truth was secondary to spectacle. Jake spent the next few days feeding the flames. He treated it like another promotional event, leaning into the controversy, throwing out challenges disguised as jokes, subtle digs wrapped in casual bravado. He made sure to mention Connor's name in interviews, weaving him into the narrative of his own career as if he were just another stepping stone. He dropped hints, teased possibilities, framing the encounter as unfinished business rather than a moment already left behind. Every calculated word carried an unspoken message. He would not let this moment slip away without shaping it into something that benefited him. Connor, on the other hand, remained silent. He did not respond to the taunts, did not engage in the theatrics, did not give Jake what he wanted. But silence was not the absence of thought. Inside the walls of his training gym, away from the noise of the outside world, Connor focused on the one thing that had always given him clarity: work. The gym where he trained bore little resemblance to the polished, high-end facilities that Jake frequented. There were no cameras here, no brand deals waiting to be signed. The air smelled of dust and old sweat, the heavy bags frayed from years of use, the ring itself a patchwork of repairs from countless wars fought on its canvas. It was a place built on struggle, where men came to sharpen themselves against one another, not for fame or clout, but because they had no choice. Connor threw himself into the rhythm of training, his body moving on instinct, his mind occupied by repetition rather than distraction. The burn in his muscles was a familiar companion, the sting of each strike against the bag, a reminder of the discipline that had carried him this far. And yet, no matter how hard he worked, there was an unshakable tension buried deep in his thoughts, an irritation that refused to fade. He had never cared for the spectacle of the sport, had never concerned himself with the noise that surrounded it. He fought because it was in his blood, because it was the only thing he had ever known. But Jake had forced something into his world that could not be ignored. It was not just the insults, not just the manufactured drama. It was the way he had taken something sacred and turned it into a performance. Connor had spent years bleeding for his place in this sport, and now, a man who had never tasted true struggle was standing at the gates, demanding to be recognized as an equal. The frustration simmered beneath the surface, unspoken but ever present. It showed in the way he moved, in the extra weight behind each strike, in the moments where his trainer had to remind him to control his breathing. And then, after another long night of training, he saw the final push that made the decision for Him. Jake had issued a challenge. It was not formal, not yet, but the message was clear. In a video that had already racked up millions of views, he had made it sound like the fight was inevitable. He had framed it as a matter of pride, of legacy, of proving who truly belonged in the ring. And then, with a smirk that had already worn thin in Conor's memory, he had left the ball in his court. The internet, of course, had done the rest. Speculation ran wild. Would Conor accept? Would he finally step up? Was he afraid? The pressure mounted with every passing hour, a growing tidal wave of expectation that threatened to pull him into its current, whether he wanted to or not. Conor had never cared about public perception, had never felt the need to prove himself to anyone but himself. And yet, as he stood in the dim light of the gym, hands still wrapped from training, sweat cooling on his skin, he knew that this was not a decision he could avoid. He did not respond with theatrics. He did not record a video, did not make an announcement, did not turn the moment into another piece of content. Instead, he reached out to his team, to the people who had been with him since the beginning, and gave them a simple instruction: make it happen. If Jake wanted a fight, he would get one, but it would not be the fight he was expecting. Word spread quickly. The challenge had been accepted, and with that, the game had changed. The negotiations began, the talks of venues and contracts, of dates and terms. But for Conor, none of that mattered. He did not care about the money, the promotion, or the inevitable circus that would surround the event. He cared about one thing: the moment when the talking would stop, when the lights would fade into the background, when all that would remain was the sound of gloves meeting flesh and bone. Jake, upon hearing the news, responded exactly as expected. He played it up, leaned into the spectacle, treating it as the next great event in his ever-growing career. He spoke about it in interviews, teased his training, made sure that every moment leading up to the fight was documented and turned into content. He sold the story of an underdog taking on a hardened fighter, twisting the narrative in ways that best served him. But beneath the bravado, there was something else. A flicker of realization, buried deep but impossible to ignore. This was different from his previous fights. He had chosen opponents carefully before, had ensured that every step of his journey was one he could control. But this was different. Conor was not here to play a role in Jake's story. He was not here to build a rivalry, to create a spectacle, to give Jake another moment in the spotlight. He was here to fight, and nothing else. And so, as the date loomed closer, as the weight of anticipation settled over them both, there was an unspoken understanding between them. They had started on opposite ends of the sport, had come from entirely different worlds. But now, for the first time, they stood on even ground. Only one of them would walk away unchanged. The night of the fight arrived like a slow-building storm, its weight pressing down on the city long before the first punch was thrown. The arena pulsed with anticipation, thousands of voices merging into a chaotic roar, cameras flashing like lightning across the sea of spectators. The energy in the building was electric, a mixture of excitement, expectation, and the raw, primal hunger for combat. This was more than just a fight. It was a spectacle, a collision of worlds, a moment that had been crafted, sold, and dissected by millions before it had even begun. In the depths of the building, beyond the noise and flashing lights, Conor sat in his locker room, wrapping his hands with quiet focus. The air was still, save for the occasional murmur from his team, the soft creak of gloves being tightened, the rhythmic breathing of a man who had trained his entire life for moments like this. He did not scroll through social media, did not check the betting odds, did not watch the pre-fight analysis. He had already done everything he could do. The time for preparation had passed, and now only the fight remained. Jake was in the opposite locker room, a very different scene unfolding around him. His team moved with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed production crew, making final adjustments, checking the cameras that had been set up to capture every moment. He played to them, shadowboxing in exaggerated movements, throwing practiced combinations with a smirk, making sure to look as effortless as possible. He thrived in moments like these, in the build-up, in the energy of the crowd. But beneath the bravado, There was tension. He knew this was different from his previous fights. He had chosen his past opponents carefully, selecting matchups that suited him, that played into his strengths, that allowed him to control the narrative. But this was different. This time, he had stepped into unfamiliar territory. The call came. It was time. Conor rose, rolling his shoulders, stretching his neck from side to side. His team surrounded him, their words steady, reassuring, but he barely heard them. He walked through the tunnel with the same measured pace he had always used. His heartbeat steady, his thoughts clear. He could hear the crowd now, the thundering bass of entrance music, the deafening mix of cheers and boos that met Jake's arrival in the ring. Jake walked with confidence, playing to the cameras, throwing loose punches as he made his way to the ring. He soaked in the energy, allowed it to fuel him, let the moment wrap around him like armor. But even as he climbed through the ropes, there was a flicker of something else in his expression, a moment where he locked eyes with Conor and saw something that unsettled him. There was no performance in Conor's gaze, no attempt to entertain. There was only cold, focused intent. The referee called them to the center of the ring. They stood inches apart, the final words of instruction barely registering between them. This was no longer about words. The bell rang and the fight began. The opening moments were slow, calculated. Conor held his ground, his hands high, his footwork measured. He watched Jake move, studied his rhythm, his stance, the slight hesitations between his jabs. Jake danced around the ring, feinting, throwing light punches, trying to control the space. He was fast, but Conor had seen faster. He was strong, but Conor had faced stronger. Then Conor struck. A sharp, precise left hook found its target, snapping Jake's head to the side. The crowd erupted. Jake stumbled, recovering quickly. But there was no mistaking the shock in his eyes. He had been hit before, but not like this. Not with the weight of years behind it, not with the precision of a man who had been throwing that same punch since before Jake had even considered stepping into a ring. Jake responded with aggression. He threw wild, heavy shots trying to force Conor backward, trying to regain control of the fight. But Conor absorbed them, slipping just enough to take the sting out of each blow, countering with crisp, efficient punches that chipped away at Jake's defenses. The first round ended, and Jake returned to his corner, his breathing heavier than he expected. His team spoke in quick bursts, offering adjustments, encouragements, but he barely heard them. Across the ring, Conor sat with the calm of a man who had not just fought a round, but had dissected one. He had seen everything he needed to see. The second round began, and Conor took control. He pressed forward, cutting off Jake's movement, forcing him into tighter spaces, making him fight at a pace he wasn't used to. He attacked the body, landing hooks that drained the energy from Jake's legs, making each step heavier, each breath more labored. Jake fought back with everything he had. He dug deep, landing sharp combinations, pushing through exhaustion, trying to turn the tide. And for a brief moment, he did. A right hand cracked against Conor's jaw, snapping his head back, forcing him to take a step away. The crowd roared. Jake saw the opening and lunged, throwing another heavy shot. But Conor had already recovered, had already read the movement, had already seen what was coming next. With perfect timing, he countered. A clean, brutal right hand landed flush, sending Jake staggering. His legs wobbled, his balance momentarily lost. The arena held its breath. He didn't fall, but the damage was done. The fight continued, round after round, each one more grueling than the last. Jake refused to go down. He fought with a determination that even Conor had to respect. He adjusted, adapted, found moments of success where none should have existed. He was not as skilled, not as experienced, but he was relentless. As the final round began, both men stood in the center of the ring, battered, exhausted, but unyielding. The crowd was deafening, but in the ring, the world had shrunk to the space between them. There was no social media here, no spectacle, no narrative to control. There was only the fight. And as the last bell rang, as the war finally ended, both men knew the truth. The decision didn't matter. The fight had already spoken for itself. The final bell echoed through the arena, cutting through the deafening roar of the crowd. Both men stood in the center of the ring, their bodies heaving with exhaustion, their faces marked with the evidence of war. Sweat dripped from their brows, their chests rising and falling with ragged breaths. The fight had ended, but the weight of what had just transpired still lingered between them, thick and unspoken. Connor took a step back, rolling his shoulders, stretching the tension from his arms. His body ached, his knuckles throbbed, but he had felt worse before. He had come into this fight with only one goal: to prove that there was a difference between men who fought for survival and men who fought for spectacle. And in his mind, that goal had been met. Jake stood across from him, his stance unsteady, his jaw clenched as he wiped the blood from his lips. He had taken a beating tonight. There was no denying that. But he was still standing. That fact alone meant something, even if it wasn't the outcome he had wanted. His whole body screamed with pain, his ribs burning from the relentless body shots he had absorbed, his legs heavy with exhaustion. But he refused to collapse. Not here. Not now. The referee stepped between them, reaching for their wrists, preparing to raise the victor's hand. The announcer's voice rang out over the speakers, reading the judge's decision, confirming what most had already known. Connor had won. His name filled the air, amplified by the cheers and chants of the crowd, a moment that should have been his triumph. But as Connor's hand was lifted in victory, his eyes remained locked on Jake. There was no celebration in his expression, no self-congratulatory grin, no taunting or arrogance, just quiet acknowledgement. A nod, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Jake exhaled, rolling his jaw, flexing his bruised hands as he turned away. He had come into this fight expecting to prove something, not just to the world but to himself. And he had, just not in the way he had imagined. He had always believed that spectacle and skill could coexist, that the show mattered as much as the fight itself. But tonight, in the ring, stripped of the cameras and the noise, he had been forced to confront a truth that had been staring him in the face all along. Connor had not just outclassed him in the ring, he had outlasted him, outworked him, outthought him. There had been no shortcuts, no scripted moments, no escape when things got difficult. It had been real, brutally so. And now, standing in the aftermath, Jake felt something he had not expected. Respect. The crowd still thundered around them, as both men stepped away, returning to their respective corners. Connor's team surrounded him, clapping him on the back, congratulating him, but he barely registered their words. His mind was still in the fight, replaying each moment, each exchange. He had won, but the victory did not fill him with the kind of satisfaction he had thought it would. Jake's team rushed to him, checking his injuries, whispering reassurances, reminding him that this was only a setback. He let them talk, nodding absent-mindedly, but his mind was elsewhere. He had lost, but he had not been humiliated. He had stood his ground against a man who had spent his entire life in this world, had gone toe-to-toe with someone who had every reason to break him apart. He had survived. As he sat on the stool in his corner, he reached for the towel draped over the ropes, wiping the sweat from his face. His muscles ached, his ribs felt like they were on fire, but beneath the pain, there was something else. A flicker of something unfamiliar. Growth. He turned his head, looking back toward Connor, watching as he spoke quietly with his team, his expression unreadable. There had been no bad blood between them, not really. Just two men from different worlds, colliding in a space that had no room for pretense. And now, after everything, they were left with only the truth of what had happened. Connor glanced toward him, meeting his gaze once more. He held it for a moment, then gave another small nod before turning away, disappearing into the tunnel leading back to the locker rooms. No parting words, no theatrics, just quiet understanding. Jake sat there for a long moment, the noise of the arena washing over him. The cameras still hovered, waiting for his reaction, for a sound bite, for something to feed the endless hunger of the audience. But for the first time in a long time, he had nothing to give them. He pushed himself up from the stool, wincing as his body protested. His team surrounded him, guiding him toward the tunnel, shielding him from the crowd. But even as he left the ring behind, the realization settled in his chest. He had lost, but for the first time in his career, he had fought a real fight. And that, more than any victory, was something that no one could take away from him.